Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we are very lucky to be joined by our youngest guest ever, Massimo Acquaro Jr.
Hello.
Massimo, do you want to share with us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So I am a 22-year-old athlete slash designer slash student. There's three lives there, combined in one. I'm currently studying at the University of Melbourne.
You throw that in for the fans?
Yeah. Shouts out. Just started my Masters in Architecture. I train at Melbourne Athletic Development. I do athletics as part of the sprint squad. And I also run a clothing brand on the side called Observe.
Observe Gallery?
Observe Gallery, full name.
Give them the name.
I like to sort of cut it down, abbreviate.
Today, we're not sure how this is going to work, so let's see how we unfold this. But basically, the main reason that we wanted to get you on is we often have this conversation around creativity and how it actually goes into quite practical professions. And we think particularly in healthcare, creativity and the exploration and the process of creativity is not used enough. And I thought it'd be really interesting for someone especially like yourself who is developing one side of your skills, which is obviously on the architecture side. And I think there's a bit more practicality that has to go into that. Then there's a really creative pursuit that you have with your brand in fashion. And we kind of wanted to get an idea of how you kind of mold the two together, because there is that level of practicality that you have to achieve a certain outcome, which we think actually links quite closely with healthcare. However, a lot of people, and Jack and I were discussing this yesterday in relation to this podcasting, like people tend to fall back into the protocol.
Well, and actually, before getting
you're cutting Massimo off.
I am actually.
I wasn't even talking.
No, well, because I was thinking, John, like, why do you think creativity is limited at the moment in healthcare? Why do you think we are not allowed to?
Well, I think it becomes we talk about this nearly every episode, but it's like this complete misconception of what evidence-based practice is.
Yeah.
That's the reason. The reason is because people think that evidence-based practice means that you only use things that have been carried out in the literature and have been peer-reviewed and typically have, been in like some double-blind, randomized controlled trial. Yeah. And that's just a complete crock of shit. That's not what evidence-based practice is. If you look at the, initial definition, we've spoken about this many times, that was developed by a physician from Canada named David Sackett in 92. Basically, it comes from three different areas and only a third of it, equal thirds, is from the evidence and the literature. So it's not to say that it's not extremely important. However, there is a level of utilization of clinical reasoning. And I think that we've lost our willingness at times to go through that process of being creative and trying. And in this profession, I think, if you said to someone like you've got to solve problems, they'd go, yeah, that's what we do. I don't know that a lot of people see that as a creative process, but I think it is, and it has to be.
Yeah, and I think it's like, just to emphasize your point about evidence-based practice, I feel like there's a messaging that we're taught that's almost in conflict with each other. There's a paradox of like, you need to use clinical reasoning and from that think about basic principles and how you apply them. But if you do that, then you're like, well, where's the high quality research to do that? But then if you're only just thinking about the high quality research, then it's like, well, is that really clinical reasoning? Is that actually going to be effective to each individual patient that you see?
Yeah. And like, I'm sure Massimo can comment on this, but it's like, I'm sure in architecture, you want to do all sorts of really interesting things, but then the engineer comes along and says, well, that building's going to fall down. So good luck trying to design it like that.
Sure.
That's right. No, it's exactly right. I mean, the great part about being an architecture student at uni means that you're given that ability to go and explore and do some crazy things that probably won't stand up.
Yeah, but I think that part of the exploration needs to be built a little bit more into healthcare. Now, it doesn't mean that you necessarily go and act on it, but I think the thought experiments are important and the process. And that leads us actually to the first thing that I want to ask you, like, actually, what is creativity to you? How do you see it and do you really have a process about how you attack that?
To me, creativity is being able to just express exactly what you're feeling, your thoughts. I think it's two different things. Feeling and thoughts are two completely different things, and they can both have different outputs. And for me, it's about depicting those things. It's not like creativity can be a range of things, but I like to depict those two things. I'd say that's what I interpret creativity as. Yeah.
I think the interesting part about that is, like from an expression point of view, particularly at the very creative end, where you take away that practicality, it doesn't need to achieve a certain outcome. Right? You might want it to, but it doesn't need to. Versus when you're in the more practical scheme, if it's, as I said, for you, it's probably more on the architecture side. For us, it's obviously 100%. You've got the patient in front of you. The practical part is they need to get a good outcome.
Yeah.
For you, it needs to be a space that not only is maybe aesthetically pleasing, but actually is practical.
Yeah, the outcome doesn't have to. There doesn't have to. When you sit down to do something, you're not really looking for a certain outcome. Maybe there's something in mind that you're trying to achieve, but you can come across that final product at any point in the creative process, and I think that's the beauty about design, especially. And maybe it's a different kind of process with you guys because you're trying to make someone sort of feel better or feel as how they were prior to an injury or something like that.
We'll get into that in a moment, because I think the architecture side probably is more closely linked than your clothing design.
I think so too.
In the sense that you have a client and you need to achieve a certain outcome. So it's not as simple as like, I'm just going to run with this idea and start designing some sort of upside down building or something, right? Even though for you, you're like, that's cool. I don't think from an engineering perspective, I can do it. The client's going to be like, well, this doesn't meet our needs.
Yeah. Well,
and for us,
you tend to learn as you progress through a course, you tend to learn what's going to work, what's not going to work. So the unrealistic stuff sort of fades from, that first year project to the third year. It's something that, that could be built.
Yeah. I imagine too, like in terms of formulating an outcome, there are certain parameters that you work in if you're given a project, that person wants a certain design or outcome. Like they're going to give you
a brief
flexibility in terms of what that looks like, but it's not like, we just want you to design something and then we'll see if we like it or
not. The unicorn client will say that.
Okay,
we'll get into that in a moment, because the thing that I wanted to ask you, in that more exploratory phase, is there a process that you go through? Because I think this is something that's interesting. I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I recently, and I say this, I listen to books. I don't read books, but it was a book by the music producer Rick Rubin, and it's called The Creative Act, and it's about the process that they go through and how he sort of tries to encourage musicians particularly to kind of explore that. And I think it's really important to note that creative people generally have a process, and they are actually very rigid in times about how they do that. It's like they always like to do it at the same time, they always like to do it in the same way, it might be in the same environment. And I think that that's something that's not necessarily always understood. I think people kind of have this concept that creativity is this like esoteric, you're just walking down the street and then a light bulb moment happens and you go, I got this great design, or I thought of this really good rehabilitation scheme, or whatever it is. I think I've solved why that person keeps getting injured. I don't think it's as esoteric as that. I think it literally is about, okay, I'm going to put myself in this space to be able to think more freely. Do you have a process that you go through that has some repeatability about it?
There is that aspect about what I do. My kind of thinking is it can come at any point. I do find that.
I think it does, but I'm saying, like, if you're sitting down to design something, whether it's architecture or it's clothing,
down. You have, like, I force myself to put something down.
It's interesting you say that. Like, if it's like a design day, what's your process? What do you do?
It's sit at the desk, and the first thing I'll do is look at precedent. I think precedent is...
When you say precedent, what do you mean?
Architectural precedent, so buildings around the world that I love. Look at materiality, how they're built, what kinds of materials they're putting together, I guess. And I love moments, so I look at different moments and where things interact, like intersect different shapes. And
you mean, when you say moments, you mean time, or are you saying like spatially?
I call them moments, spatial moments. I think I love to put an interesting moment in my work that doesn't make sense, or will have people point it out and they'll be like, what's going on here? I enjoy that. But back to the creative process, I think, so looking at precedent is the first thing I'll do. And I don't think, like, a lot of people will think about this as copying and not taking inspiration. I think looking at people and what they've done in the past and what they've done right is a great way to learn. Like, if you want to do things right, look at other people that have done things right. It's simple.
Well, I think that feeds very strongly into the healthcare process, because I think that's what, if you're unsure about how to solve a problem, like one of the first things I think you do get encouraged to do is go and look at the literature, like what actually exists out here. Yeah. And then maybe, as you said, like reach out. We spoke about this on a podcast recently about like when things go wrong, like what are some of the steps you can put in place. And one of them is reach out to a colleague that you think actually might have experience there. And I think it's the same with what you're mentioning of go and look at pieces of work that potentially going to help you understand how to solve the problem that's in front of you.
You just got to be careful in the creative industry though with that stuff.
Why is that?
Because you just don't want to be done for copying. That's it. You can go and look at precedent, but you need to add your own flavour to it. With healthcare, maybe if something's worked in the past, you can do that with your own client and sort of replicate it straight off the book. But yeah, you've got to be super careful with how you use precedent, especially in design, I think. Yeah.
If something is like reasonably unique in terms of it, like that's very much this style, and my lack of knowledge in say architecture or even clothing design, if it's very obvious that you've been influenced by that, like how much trouble can you get in? Like how much do you have to change it for it to be like, no, you just copied us?
Yeah, I mean, being at uni, you see a lot of that stuff popping around, and unfortunately, because I haven't been in a firm environment and haven't really got the knowledge about that stuff, I couldn't tell you like the amount of trouble you get in, but it becomes very obvious. You can be called out. But yeah, at uni, you've just got murmurs of, this looks exactly like this project, and they've taken the floor plans exactly from there. That's why it's got a good mark.
Yeah, okay.
That kind of thing. But yeah, just not working in the real world with architectural stuff. I couldn't tell you the exact like protocol with how that goes.
The concept, as you said, you're putting yourself in that space, and do you find that if you actually do go through that process of looking through precedent, it starts to generate ideas for you? Is that why you do it?
Yeah, that's like I was saying, like that's the first thing. I need to get in that creative space. I need to see design to be able to then generate those ideas. Then, like I said, get something down on the page, get a floor plan down. And something I learnt from one of my favorite tutor, Leon Kamuras, he's someone that would force us to do a floor plan in the first week, where other classes would not even touch that in the first 5. But this is because once you get that floor plan down, then you can start working. Build on it. You're pushing and pulling shapes each week.
I think that's a really good concept, because I think that fits very nicely even with the healthcare model of like, get your foundation down and then you can start, as you said, manipulate what that looks like if you think that the individual needs a certain level of problem solving around that.
Yeah.
In terms of your physical environment, where do you like to do this?
My room. I like a private space.
Is it like a cave?
It's not a dark room.
No, I mean, like, do you lock yourself in there? Is it quiet? Do you have music? Like, what's your actual environment like?
I'm always listening to music.
Okay.
Always listening to music. I'm hearing bangs on the wall to turn the music off at all times of the day.
But you don't wear headphones?
I like it out loud.
Yeah, I would be banging too.
Yeah, I like it out loud music. And yeah, the music will set my mood, and I think design kind of flows out of that space there.
I think that's interesting. Jack, do you have, when you're sort of like, reviewing something for a patient, or you're writing your notes, or do you ever set an environment like that?
Yeah, in fact, I find the best time to do that is outside of my normal environment. So that is not actually necessarily in the room or even at home, but actually going outside and going for a walk. That's often the time I find you start, like, I just naturally start processing stuff, but you start seeing things differently. And I actually wonder if that has to do with the physical environment is an open environment that you don't associate with that kind of fixed way of thinking.
Yeah, there's a lot of that evidence. Like, I think we've spoken about flow before, but for instance, like having an open horizon view actually is conducive to more wide-ranging thoughts. Like, it's not, if you're in a closed box, your actually ability to think laterally reduces. And that's been shown in sort of the neuroscience.
Yeah, I think the other big one too is going off a bit of a tangent, but actually looking up Like when you're outside, you look up in the trees. And I
don't know about you. I'm looking down.
No, I spend a lot of time looking up.
Is that why you keep walking into street poles?
Probably one of the many reasons. No, but even if you're looking down though too, you know, it's very different to just say looking straight ahead. And I actually wonder too how much that influences your thought process. I know that sounds a bit wishy-washy in a way, but because it again changes the actual physical parameters of what you see. And looking at things on a different axis as well. It was actually just a question I wanted to ask you. You know, you were talking before, Massimo, about almost like getting inspired by looking at other people's work, but at the same time, making sure you don't copy people's work. Do you think it's something important in your creative process, whether it's your studies in architecture, but even with clothing, when you see something that actually you find appealing or inspiring, do you often think about why do I actually find that pleasing aesthetically, or even maybe from like an architectural standpoint?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it kind of builds into biases, doesn't it? Well, our own attraction.
I often think of it too of like, again, healthcare, where if you have a colleague or a clinician who's meant to be an expert in a certain field, they might say something like, look, these are the things that I do clinically and found them useful. And there's the obvious thing to do, like, oh great, I'm just going to copy what they do.
Yeah. Because
that seems like the obvious thing. Or you can start to think about, well, why do they actually do those interventions? Why do they set the parameters that way? How is that different to what I do? Because then you actually have a deeper understanding of why that leads to potentially good outcomes, or in your situation, why is that actually visually or aesthetically pleasing?
Yeah, it comes down to bias. Like you generate or you build your own interests and aesthetic style over time. And mine's changed over the last 4 years. But you're influenced by your tutors at uni, especially. You can start to tell what they like and the style of design that will then enhance your grade, right?
Yeah.
But that's a
dangerous game, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's a first to second year style of thinking, and I kind of hate it, to be honest.
Well, this is good, because this is a question that I wanted to ask you about. Two things. One, where do you have you thought about where your aesthetic comes from, and you said it's evolving, like why it's evolving. And the second thing is, like you just mentioned then that you're strong to want to maintain to your own style. How do you think that balances? We'll come to this, but how do you think that balances with achieving outcomes for whether it's your business or the clients that you're dealing with at a architectural level?
I think, I like to stay true to what I like, and I hope that if there are clients that are coming to me one day, you've got your unicorn client that doesn't really exist, but if someone's coming to you, they want to see your spin on something, something realistic, but they want to see that whatever you are known for to be input into your design.
I think that's an interesting concept, right? Because I know that I struggle with this. You get patients who get referred to you, right? And you they know sort of a little bit about you, and then it's like they're expecting something different from you. And it's like, no, this is the way I approach this problem, right? And I think that that's an interesting one, because you go through this process as a healthcare profession. We talk about this a lot, about trying to individualize, of working out whether you can solve problems for every type of patient that you see, versus, as you said, are you better off more trying to attract the ones that do fit your sort of, well, for us it's clinical bias, but
are you
design bias?
Are you ever learning? If you're always attracting people that are interested in your own way and your own style of practice or design, are you ever being pushed to experiment with something different?
Well, I think that's a good question.
That comes back to creativity.
Yeah.
And maybe that fear of creativity, because it's often associated with failure potentially. Am I going to get something wrong if I'm really experimenting?
Well, that's a good point.
Yeah, a question I wanted to ask, thinking about creativity, do you think, you're talking about your current experience at uni, where you are creating designs based on what you perceive to be the preference of your lecturers or tutors?
No, I won't do that anymore.
Well, because I was going to say, do you feel like that's stifling your creativity process?
Yes.
Do you think it's actually better to go, here are things that you need to understand with the process of designing, and you actually then you do a project, you do an assessment, you go, here is my product. And you can be able to justify why you did all the things you did. Now, for your person marketing, they might be like, look, this isn't actually appealing to me whatsoever, but you've actually gone through the process and justified why. This is something that I often think, and we talked about this before, John, but like through healthcare, of like, are we actually better to go, look, here are the things that you need to understand in terms of there's a subjective component of your assessment, there's an objective component of your assessment. Here are different interventions you can use, and these are the parameters. Now, here's a problem. You know bits of all these areas.
Show me how you're going to put this process
Put it together.
Well, and we spoke to Richard about this recently. Like he mentioned, like he really wants to shift to more of this model of education where it's not this is the right answer or this is the protocol that you should have selected. It's show me that you can think through a problem.
Yes, because I think particularly at university, when it's an environment where you can do that, and at the end you might be like, look, that's definitely not the way I'd go about approaching, assessing, treating back pain, whatever it is, but actually you've shown some really good reasoning here, and you've actually understood scientific principles, and there's obviously things like, through that process you give them feedback, as opposed to that standard of like, no, that's not the right way, this is how you should do it. I feel like straight away you're creating that barrier of like, well, as a student, am I meant to think independently and come to my own conclusions, or do you want me to just replicate what you're doing?
And I think this speaks to what Massimo just mentioned, which is that the creative process, and I don't think you should look at it as like, right and wrong. It's more exploratory than that, but it's like, we're often, particularly in an academic sense, taught that there is a right answer. And even in a healthcare setting, it becomes very clear, like, this is the outcome that we're searching for. I think the thing that you have to recognize is how you end up there might be very different. So along the way, you're going to try things that may not work. What do you think leads into that mentality of being able to see things along the way as steps rather than necessarily wrong turns? And
what leads into that mentality?
Yeah, because I think like it's very interesting because architecture I think it's an interesting course, and I think it's an interesting kind of group that it attracts. It seems to attract the more practical, creative people, right? Which sounds strange to say because they're usually people who, if they wanted to, they could probably go into more fine arts. They could go into more like clear design work. But they're like, no, I want a career. I want a professional career that has some level of practicality, right? So they often are the more your type A personalities. They're usually academically quite inclined. And so it's this weird, to me, and I find architects strange, right? Like from a personality point of view, because to me, it almost doesn't match. They're like type A, right, wrong personality, but then they're doing something that has to be super creative. And to me, they don't necessarily gel and this is my ignorance, but in my mind, a really creative person doesn't see right and wrong. They just see like a spectrum of like opportunities. So I think architecture in itself attracts a very interesting crowd. Is that something that you've observed?
Definitely, yeah. I think almost having that being surrounded by like architects or potential architects at school and the degree itself, I sort of wanted another outlet where I could
be more creative.
Yeah, because I still don't. Architecture just doesn't allow me to go nuts. I feel like. Well,
I feel like it's similar. As I said, it's in many ways it's very similar to healthcare. Like you're not going to go outside certain boundaries. For you guys, it's like mechanistically you can't go outside an engineering
to a point.
Like you can't design something that's going to fall down. And for us, like you can't design someone that is something in your rehabilitation or your intervention that's going to, cause harm. You have to try and get an outcome that's positive and achieves the outcomes that the patient desires. But it does have the ability to explore. And I think that we've lost that. And I think there would be, do you feel like sometimes there is elements of that in architecture where you end up just copy pasting because you're like, well, I know that this will achieve the outcome for the practicality point of view.
You'll find that you sort of take certain elements from buildings. You won't copy and paste an entire thing, but you'll take elements that you know have worked. Like I've got a project I'm working on at the moment, and there's a beautiful sliding door that connects two buildings. And it's Lateral and Vessel. And I've sort of taken that. Yeah,
whatever that means.
Yeah. Whatever that means. If anyone's knows what they're talking about. Yeah. Beautiful sliding door. And I've taken that and put that into the project. And what that does almost, and in architecture, it's cool because it shows that you've got knowledge about your field, and it's you're well researched and well versed in the industry. And when you do little elements, it's okay. But going back to your question, I think I tried to stay away from that as much as I can. But I've seen it happen often where students will be told, yeah, do this because it'll get you a good grade, and they just.
Do you think it's interesting? Because I think that this is I feel like it's a short-term play that will get you a lot further in the short term, but in the long term potentially limits your progression. And I think it's the same in healthcare.
I had that argument with my teacher.
Oh, really? About what happened?
That, exactly that.
Yeah, so
with Leon as well. I love him, but there's times where it's encouraging that to use precedent and it helps your learning because you're copying what's right. But I said to him that I want to produce something that I did. If it's wrong, I don't care, but I did it. And I'll learn from the elements that are wrong in the project or that don't work. We can't say wrong because it's never really wrong or right.
They didn't work for whatever reason.
Yeah, it didn't work for some reason, but I did it. It's not like I've just got this perfect project that has been produced in real life and I haven't really done any thinking by myself. It's that process of thinking in your room and getting things wrong or having an element of your project that you need to work on, that little space in the back corner that just doesn't feel right. That's that process of getting out of that hole over 2 to 3 weeks and being told by a tutor that's wrong or that's not right. It's that process that's where the real learning's done.
I think that fits into a concept that we talk about quite a bit, which is safe to fail experiments. And I don't know whether you've heard that phrasing before, but essentially like the way that we see it is, particularly when you are working within a framework that does have limitations, whether it's a design brief or a project that has a brief to it. For us, it's obviously, you've got to live by certain parameters in your work, like, do no harm. You're trying to achieve the outcomes for the patient that they're after, reduce pain, improve function, all those kind of things. But it opens up this concept that you're trying to experiment, you're trying to explore, and you're trying to find little ways in which to see whether you can shift the trajectory of that person towards the outcome that you want. I see it almost like, I'm sure you do this in a design feature of like you have iterations. It's like, I'm sure, there's probably a CAD file that you're working on. It's just like 400 different versions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something you show weekly. You get feedback on that weekly.
It's interesting because I always thought about this, like, I know that it varies a lot, and I love movies. I wouldn't say that I'm that well versed in it, but like I'm always really interested to see the difference between, say, certain directors. And like, for instance, I know that some directors are like, 2 shots, we're out of here. And then, like one of the greatest directors I think of all time, Martin Scorsese, if he doesn't like it, he'll just get you to keep going, right? And I saw this thing recently with Jonah Hill talking about when he did The Wolf of Wall Street with him, they were like 70 takes into something. And he's just like, nah, this isn't working, right? And
a vision. Just got a vision.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting about that, because I don't know that we think about this in healthcare, of like, you can be very iterative with what you do, and it doesn't make you wrong. You just haven't quite arrived at the destination you're looking for. And I don't know that you get a lot of license to be super creative in our space with like a patient in front of you and you're trying to get outcomes. But the reality is, even in this concept of safe to fail experiments, you're essentially running these little experiments, and for you it might be small iterations, until you arrive at a destination that is actually achieving the greatest outcome. And it's really hard to explain that to a patient, but I think it works in the creative sense, and it works, we talk a lot about complex adaptive systems. You have to interact with that system in that way, because if you don't, you're misinterpreting the way in which the interactions occur. And I think you would understand this. Like one of the concepts that we talk about a lot in complex adaptive systems is that the relationships are non-linear, meaning that like 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. I think the cool thing about creativity and creative pursuits is that's often the case. You add a little element, as like a little design feature, a little moment, and all of a sudden it's not just 1 + 1 = 2. It's like that equals 74. And but I'm saying like everyone loves that.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's in a song,
exactly.
whether it's in a building, it's like, oh, I just love the way that looks. And it's such a little feature. It's such a little tweak, but it completely changes the aesthetic of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it separates it.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing happens a lot in healthcare where you're trying little iterations and you're like, oh, this isn't quite working. This isn't quite working. This isn't quite working. And then you try an intervention that, again, you've run it through the system of reviewing it with, whether it's another staff member that you or a colleague, you've reviewed it with as a precedent with like literature.
The bullshit process almost of like, is this crap or is this actually something?
Yeah. But like you try something and then bang, it changes the whole thing. It's like, oh, I don't have any pain anymore. Like you did, we spoke through that in something like that recent podcast, Jack, of like that case study.
Yeah.
Like where it was just like bang, all of a sudden, huge change in their force output in their hamstring function. And that was so much because like you tried something that you thought, okay, there's plausibility to this, there's literature that supports it. I'm going to run a safe to fail experiment. He might have turned around and said, no, made no difference, Jack. I'm
sure.
Same.
Yeah. Oh, and that happens.
Right, but it went boom.
But you had to go through that iteration. You had to sit there and do it.
Well, I also think though too, what you're highlighting here is, do you have that mindset to be able to continue the thought process outside of your clinical hours for us? Because like the reality is there are certain constraints that we have in terms of we have a certain amount of time with the patient. If you're working in private practice, they're coming in, they're paying, they expect certain results in a certain period of time. So, I think so much of what you do in the clinic when you're seeing a patient is reflective of what you're thinking and the process of processes you go through outside of that environment, whether that's with your colleagues, like we obviously speak a lot to each other in the clinic, but, going back to going for a walk outside and actually,
changing that environment to open up that openness in terms of your thinking because the environment is more open as well.
Yeah, and like it's actually interesting because I feel like that does two things. One, it shows that you're curious and passionate, but it's interesting because I know that a lot of older clinicians always say that young physios, although they might not necessarily do the best treatment, whatever that may be or how that looks like, they'll often still have good outcomes with patients because their enthusiasm means that when they fail, they'll be like, oh, well, let's try this or let's try that. And often patients are actually much more willing to go along with that process as opposed to like trying to do the same thing again and not getting anywhere or showing that like seeming somewhat disinterested or disengaged with what you're doing, even when things
we spoke about angles
out.
yesterday, like how do you maintain, it's almost in that, that Zen philosophy of like maintaining the child's mind. Like how do you see the problem that's in front of you with all of your prior knowledge, with all of your bias? How do you actually end up arriving at a position where you can look at it with some freshness? Now it doesn't mean you throw out what you know, but like how do you put something on that is specific to that individual so that you can get a good outcome?
I was going to say, I've had first-hand experience of John calling me out of hours, away from training, away from the gym.
That doesn't sound like John.
Often
annoying
a realization of,
oh yeah,
even still, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to get back. It was someone that's thinking constantly. That's just his character. Is always trying to find a solution outside of the gym. I don't think work stops when you leave the gym.
Well, I think the good thing, I think the thing that awards you an opportunity to really see the product of thinking and tinkering is coaching. Because like I think of it similar to if you're a physio working, say, in a elite sporting club where you have the same group of people, and you see them 5-6 days a week.
The good thing is I've noticed with that is I think it really, the thing that seems to, there seems to be two factors with working in elite sport. One is, unfortunately, they seem to be held to protocols often because there's liability and there's a lot of money involved and responsibility of like, this player is getting paid $1 million a year. Let's not fuck up this rehab.
And not to mention, like, depending on the philosophy of, say, the head physio or the manager who's
or
like,
the
this is what we do.
Yeah. But the cool thing that I think that they do really well is they actually have a lot of meetings around what the management will be. And I think that opens up a lot of exploration. So I think that's... And, most people would recognize this, like we did PBLs, problem-based learning.
Yep.
I think the cool thing that they always forced you to do, and I at the start I thought it was so stupid. It was literally just like put down every concept or idea or relevant piece of information that could potentially influence this. And I always thought it was such a waste. It was like, we're just rushing. Like, I was just like, rush, like, get through this. We don't need to worry about that. But it actually opens your field of vision. And as I said, that's that ability, as I said, to go into that exploration mode. I don't know that, as I said, we as a profession encourage that. Like I asked Mass about how do you get into that space, and you obviously mentioned things like being outdoors and actually trying to explore it. I don't know that we encourage that enough.
Well, it's funny when you talk about problem-based learning. The one thing I always found difficult with it is they wanted you to draw like the here goes to here. Everything was very linear, and I always used to think like
that doesn't work.
I don't know if this is actually how it would really work. And as you learn more about human system, you're like, it's probably a little bit too simplistic. But I do agree with the idea that it's like just put everything down that you think that actually may be relevant, because there's probably a lot more things than you potentially think. And not to mention like that can be just really straightforward to have it down like, oh yeah, actually you didn't really look at their range of movement or whatever it is. Like sometimes it might be something very simple.
One of the ideas, because I think it fits into very much your clothing design. We haven't spoken much about that, but you run a clothing brand called Observe Gallery, and it seems to be doing really well. It seems to be really growing, which is awesome to see. I think that you have a very specific aesthetic that you kind of try and develop, but it has evolved a lot. Do you think that like one, I asked you before and I don't think we got to it, like what do you think influences that? I'll let you answer that. What do you think influences the aesthetic that you actually are attracted to?
As Alessia and I grow up, I think we've found that we're into different styles of dressing, and you then, running a clothing brand, you need to know what's going on in the world, in the fashion industry all the time. So you find out about different brands and what they're doing, different styles. And I think that inspiration comes from research again. It's the same process as architecture. But also as you grow up, you start to find you like a certain cleaner style. I don't know. As the brand has evolved, like you said, I think we've gone from doing just leisure wear into more refined pieces and minimalistic stuff. And is that minimalistic style though? Is that similar to your general creative slant? Is that like a creative bias that you have? Like, do you design in that way and similar to architecture? I was going to say, it's very similar to my architectural style.
Do you like the thing that I ask with that is like, do you actually consider your bias in that and whether that is a good thing or a bad thing? Because I think that the interesting thing with you doing this as a business is it does influence the outcome.
Big time.
Right? So, and I think, Jack, one of the things that you get better at, hopefully, as a clinician who is, going through this assessment process is you start to work out what your biases are. Oh, I always like to do, an excessive amount of strength work in my rehabilitation rather than, elastic type work, or I like to attack these problems in this certain way. And I think...
Well, so much of that, again, is just because you're a product of your environment too. Part of that is thinking who has influenced you and why. Because then I think big part of that then is, are you surrounded in an environment or with people that encourage lateral thinking or encourage you to be able to at least challenge your own bias?
So do you, with that in mind, from what even Jack's saying, like do you go out of your way to try and challenge yourself, even if it's in the similar kind of clothing design, and be like, okay, this is not something I would design, but maybe what can I learn from that?
Yeah, I think, and you sort of touched on it earlier, I think being dictated by customer is something very dangerous. And yeah, if I could design, if I could just do what I wanted, everything would be navy. I love navy, but you can't. You can't do that. I was thinking about it in the car on the way here. What am I doing for summer? What colours am I doing?
Navy.
I can't do navy again. And I'm lucky I'm working with a partner, because the partner it's not always the same vision, and you're pulled up on, not everyone's going to like this. You can't just do the same thing over and over. You can't do what you want all the time.
Because I think that's an interesting process. Like, speak a little bit about that in terms of like the trends, because I feel like, again, in the short term, you can probably make more money in your clothing business by following popular trends, and often I feel like Australia is usually a few months behind, so you probably even have time to kind of almost copy what other people do, and I'll let you answer that, but like, I'll put this to Jack as well for after, is I see the same bullshit happening in physio where it's like a couple of papers come out from a certain group and then everyone's doing this, you know, like I think the prime example of that is like isometrics for tendon loading. And it's like, guys, like, don't get caught up on that just because it's the hot thing from this group. Do you actively fight against that? Do you follow that because you're like, okay, we need some short-term wins from a business perspective?
Yeah, it's a very fine line with that. It's an interesting question, and you find that if you're not going along with the current trends, it's like a business risk. We're going to make as much as we need to then continue forward. And you sort of break down your collection in a certain way when you're putting things together. You'll have items that you know are going to sell. So often here in Melbourne, where people love leisure wear, and I think that's born out of COVID. I think people found that they're always wearing fleece and stuff. So you'll put together a sort of a few fleece pieces. But then for us, and this has happened in the last year and a bit, we really want to stay away from what everyone else is doing and cliche, and you know, you're trying to be different and everything. But we're trying to take a risk.
Is that from are you taking that risk from a business perspective, or are you taking it from like a personal creative desire to want to explore?
It is a bit of both. But what I think is that it's a long-term goal. Yeah. It's not a point. And this relates exactly back to what we were speaking about with architecture. If you go and copy a precedent, you win in the short term. But have you learnt how to then design properly, which will then influence your design in the long term? Is that a long-term play? No. What we're trying to do at the moment is forego that small win here and build business longevity to have a brand that's respectable and be around in the long term.
This is interesting because I think that this builds into a certain psychology. For those people that I think it's a best-selling book by two Japanese authors called like The Courage to Be Disliked. And I really like, there's certain concepts in the book that I really like, and it's written in a bit of an odd way, but basically it's giving people permission to do things that maybe other people don't perceive as being, you know, the best from that interaction point of view, but also it allows them to explore these things. And I'm actually reminded, as Massimo was talking, I'm reminded of you, Jack, of like, I think that you often have the courage to explore things that generally people might see as being a little bit left of center. You know, like I think the prime example, and we've spoken about it a lot, and obviously we've had Antonio on, is, you know, the myofascial understanding and, you know, fascial manipulation and all that kind of stuff. And you've gone out of your way and actually invested quite significantly to do some of the courses you're doing and all that kind of stuff. But if you bring that concept up with people, they don't really know what you're talking about, and you're almost a bit of a pariah talking about some of these things because they think it's almost like, you know, like it's invalid science or something like that, which it's not.
Yeah, well, this is actually a perfect segue to a question I wanted to ask you, Massimo, because it's so much more easier to compare, say, architecture or clothing internationally. And the question I had is, do you think in Australia we're more conservative when it comes to architectural designs or clothing when you compare it to...
I think I'll comment more on the clothing side of things.
Yeah, okay, sure.
I think architecture is very limited as well. I think it is. I think Europe is so much further ahead in every area of design.
Well, the reason why I say that...
They're encouraged to do it. They're encouraged to experiment. Here we're very safe.
Well, and I see the same in health professions too, and part of that, I think, is perhaps our geographical location. Like we are actually physically very separated from a lot of the world, so we don't get a regular exposure to different cultural ideas. And then I think that emphasises that relatively conservative mindset of not wanting that much change. And like that's very evident in healthcare and within physiotherapy, where you're talking about fascial manipulation. You see people almost become potentially
Defensive.
aggressive.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just about facial manipulation. It's about anything that goes outside the conventional
or even what they understand
parameters. It's like when you don't do that, or like where's the research for that? And it's funny because that in itself, you go, well, there is actually research
you
there.
just haven't seen
just
it.
because you haven't read it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But it's a, as opposed to that curiosity of like, oh, like I actually
Haven't
never heard
heard
of
about it,
this,
yeah.
or like can you actually tell me what the whole premises is about? And almost, having that humility to be like, I actually don't know what you're talking about.
Well, we spoke about this week, didn't we? When I think it's one of those things that potentially as a professional, as you get further on, if you do maintain a level of curiosity, you have that openness. Like I've really noticed with some of our guests, like our older guests who I think are very, very high level professionals, seem a lot more open to saying, oh, I don't know that much about that. Like, can you send me some papers, Jack? Or, like, oh, that's a really interesting concept. I'll have to think about that. Versus some of the younger professionals who have almost been like, yeah, next topic.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they don't want to... Weirdly, as I said, I think there is a psychological... They don't want to go through the discomfort of being like, oh, I don't know anything about that. And that's a little bit scary to me.
Well, and like ultimately, this whole concept of creativity is so much about mindset because the reality is there is a discomfort with going to that space of like, I'm going to try something different here. And the reality is creativity also comes with failures, but then that comes back to setting up safe to fail experiments so that, in healthcare, it's not detrimental, so to speak. But like understand that the process is not always going to be necessarily have good outcomes, but the reality is you get an opportunity to see a non-linear effect when you go like, oh wow, that really different.
Worked.
That worked. What is that? And then all of a sudden you get an opportunity to integrate something new into what you do that really starts to separate the outcomes you get with the patients. And I think even for you as an individual, as a clinician. And I feel like that's something that we need to really think about encouraging more. Because I think ultimately a lot of this comes back to, do you feel comfortable to step into that level of discomfort, to step into that unknown?
I can't agree with you more. I think I do want to jump back to Mass for a sec about he mentioned, and I'd get your opinion on this too, Jack, but like you mentioned European design and it being different. Is that different to North America, who tends to be the other big influencer? And do we see other cultural changes or cultural influences on the way that people kind of approach the creative process?
I found that Australian clothing design tends to be more similar to what America's doing. Mm-hmm. I think that leisure wear stuff stems from North America.
Do you think that that's because culturally we're similar?
I think so. I think so too. Yeah. I think in Europe that it's like this risk-taking culture that's sort of...
I don't know if it's risk. I think it's like creatively they're willing to take chances.
I think in Europe, because it is, a mixing bowl of so many different cultures, I think there's a lot more openness to accepting differences.
Yes.
As opposed to here, because we're very homogenous.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually,
and the States is probably similar to an extent. Yeah.
It's pretty homogenous, yeah.
It is, and it's such a generalization, but I think a lot of people in the United States sort of, I'll give you a good example of, I think, how a lot of people in America think. I remember when we were in Italy at the start of the year to do the fashion manipulation course, we were all introducing ourselves. Hi, I'm Jack from Australia. Hi, I'm John from Italy. When it came to the Americans, it was always like, hi, I'm Tim from California. They didn't say the United States. They'd always say their state.
Why?
Well, it was funny. Antonio.
He asked that.
Antonio laughed because Antonio works at New York University and lives there for part of the year, and he goes, classic American, they always just assume that there's nothing outside of the United States.
Yeah.
But
I think
as opposed to
that mentality's sort of come over here as well. I kind of think with
totally. Yeah. As opposed to Europe, where like literally there is so many countries within a small space with such diverse histories, such diverse culture, language, and so on. So there's probably a lot more acceptance to going like, oh, yeah, that's different in terms of how that person presents themselves or the ideas that they come with.
I think but the creative culture's just embraced a lot more over there, and it's encouraged, I'd say. I think here it's not as big because it's almost like it's considered, and this comes from how you're brought up as well. But it's almost like you want to get a real job, and that creativity, the industry of creativity, it tends to not fall under that banner. It's like you've got to go to an office job and
again, I think it fits into that linearity idea of like people see productivity and success based on hard work, and it's it's almost the Adam Smith idea of like productivity equals the outcome that you're going to get, and like the whole capital system being based on hours worked. But it's not as simple as that. It's not just based on labor. It's unfortunately now I think it's the most obvious thing. If most people are trying to do something that creates some sort of exponential opportunity, because otherwise you can't get ahead. You only have so many hours in the day. That's right. I think European culture, whilst I think for a lot of Australians is uncomfortable because they are often perceived as being very lazy, they actually very much embrace this idea that like they need to provide opportunity for them to be able to explore things in a much more creative sense.
Yep.
Whereas I think the interesting, I think I brought this up with you yesterday, like I think Americans fit into the opposite. They're always trying to hack things. So it's always like shortcuts, and it's like technology seems to be the thing that I think they have a really cool creative culture when it comes to technology.
Absolutely.
But it's always like, we want to shortcut this. We want to like jump a million steps and beat everyone. Which is why I think like in America, healthcare seems to be very driven by want for technological advancement. In Europe, it seems to be very heavily driven for intellectual understanding. And I think that that's very heavily driven by, as we just mentioned, those cultural differences. And I think Australia seems to sit somewhere a little bit in between.
Well, and I don't think we consider that enough in healthcare, because like, again, just one of the great things of this course I'm doing in Italy is I'm the only Australian there. The majority are from Europe. There's a few people from the States, a couple from Africa, all over the world. And it's very interesting, particularly all the European people, they seem to have a lot of different ideas and things that they do clinically. And that in itself is quite interesting, where it's like, there's so much openness to the kind of things that you guys do. And some of them some things I'd heard about, some things I hadn't heard about. But that in itself, I think, was a real insight to being like, wow, okay, in Australia, we do really have a certain mindset that influences how we approach healthcare and how we think about evidence-based practice and what's considered acceptable and what's considered not acceptable. Because I think that's the other big one too, where if you come with an alternative idea, but there's actually good justification and rationale for it, I think there should be encouragement to be like, okay, like,
do you think that creates that environment for people to be a little bit less scared?
Oh, absolutely.
Because I mentioned to you, like, in preparation for this, like, how much do you want to be, influenced versus being the influencer? Do you think, and I think Australian culture is bad for this, very bad. Like, everyone knows about the concept of tall poppy syndrome.
Exactly, yeah.
Do you feel actually some of that with the work that you do, that like if you start to use a bit more of that mindset of exploring things in slightly more, and I think there is the exploration of this, but like that more open mentality, and you start saying, no, I want this to be an aesthetically driven business, or my architecture design to be aesthetically driven.
You tend to, and I think it's obvious at the moment for us, taking that turn and taking a few risks with what we're producing, you find that the following doesn't grow as fast as it used to.
Yeah. I feel like that's always the case.
A lot of trend-following brands.
Oh, they blow up.
That are blowing up. And it's because of TikTok and jumping on that bandwagon.
But it's following that trend.
Yeah. And as much as I love being different and everything, it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of...
I think that's one of the hardest things to recognise, because there is a level of bravery with that. And I feel like, part of one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast, people probably think it's a bit of an odd podcast that we did, but was to actually encourage people to be more creative in their healthcare pursuit, because I think it does take a little bit of bravery to go exploring ideas and concepts that aren't the protocol that does have, the randomized controlled trial behind it. Now, we're not telling you to take unnecessary risks or do anything that would put anyone in harm, but it is important to explore this, because if you don't, you're potentially leaving really big opportunities for growth, both in our knowledge and also in the potential outcomes that we get on the table that are there to be explored.
And it might not be you that comes across that amazing discovery, but you taking that step out of your comfort zone can encourage others to take that step.
It's such an interesting idea, this, because I think it comes like it's a very idealistic way of looking at what you do, and I don't know that everyone has that in them, because you do have to survive in the the short term. But it's like you look at some of the greatest artists of all time, whether it's musicians, and this is over hundreds and hundreds of years. Musicians, painters, they often die poor, and then their art is worth
because people realise later
like this person was a genius.
And if it's in music as well, it's not always that person. It's not the one that blew up. It's someone that did something very similar to what they did.
Yeah, they were the one that... And it's always funny because you hear that concept often of like when they ask that person, oh, you did this. It's like, wasn't me. Like I was influenced by X. Like they were the genius.
Yeah.
Like I love them. Like if you like me, then you need to go and they're like almost encouraging people like go and buy their music or go and like look at this stuff because this is, this was so far ahead of its time, but they weren't the people that actually made it.
Yeah.
But they spawned a whole maybe new genre or a subgenre of something. And I think that does take a level of idealism where you're like, well, and I always love that quote, and I don't know who it's from, but it's like, you plant the tree that you will never sit under, or something like that.
It's cool. Yeah,
it's like something along those lines, and I'm stuffing that up, so I apologize. But it's like,
but it makes sense still.
Yeah,
I get what you're trying to say.
Yeah, do the things for the generations that come.
Yeah.
Because you want to see them have more knowledge or have a more interesting experience or have the ability to explore things in a way. And I think, as I said, that does have a level of idealism that is definitely much more related to older cultures, because I think they see that multi-generational idea. I think it's a problem that we have in Australia is because...
Even just modern culture, like being a bit too concerned about oneself.
Yeah, very individualistic. And I think that's actually one of the big, we won't get into the political side of it, but like it's one of the big things that I think is a huge, confrontation between, say, Indigenous culture of Australia and the modern culture of Australia is like this understanding of multi-generational kind of development. They see it as one continuous generational thing, whereas now we just see it as our individual family or whatever it is. Yeah. We won't take up too much more of your time, Mass, but one thing that we always like to ask our guests is something that you're currently pursuing, learning, exploring, that might be related to your work, might be related to your study, but is kind of capturing your interest at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we've recently moved manufacturers to someone who works with massive brands, and the detail that goes into our new product development is crazy. So the stuff I'm learning at the moment are the little things that I thought just you sort of run your eye over. Things like ribbing on shirts, or there's different types of ribbing, and I mean I'm exploring so many more materials at the moment that can be used for your garments. I think I'm doing a lot more work in the clothing side of things than architecture, so there's a lot of learning happening there. But the big thing is the detail that's going into tech packs that you're submitting, because you don't want to leave.
What's a tech pack?
A tech pack is just something you submit to a supplier with pretty much every single detail and measurement of a garment, and that has evolved over time for me.
You used to just be slap a few bumper stickers on it.
34-inch waist, 32-inch length.
Oh, it's crazy how much detail goes into a piece, and to make sure it's right, because again, you don't want to leave anything to chance. You don't want to leave them making any decisions for you.
Here's an interesting question, because this makes me think of something. With that, how do you reconcile that with the creativity side, or is that the outcome? Once you've gone through that creative process, then you can be very specific about what you want.
That's right. Yeah, you want to design the garment first. It's not like we're creating crazy pieces that don't sit on your body correctly. Things have been done before. It's just the way it's styled. I think that we're trying to do a little bit differently to what others are doing. But yeah, you design your garment first, and then you need to make sure that based on industry as well. You go back to the industry standard of how things sit on your body and how things make people feel like when it's on their body.
I think that's a good concept.
You need to make sure that that's right.
Yeah, I think that's a good concept
right.
because it's kind of like, again, if we go full circle back to the healthcare side of things, it's like, just because you've gone through a creative process, it doesn't mean that you're not still trying to get a good outcome where
Right.
you've reduced their pain, their function, they've been able to return to whatever activity they want to do. You might have that process where you're like, okay, I'm really exploring here, but then you still got to end up at a certain point. And then when you're there, you have to be, as you said, quite pointed and quite directed and be very clear on like, okay, these are the steps we're going to take. Right now I'm being very specific and clear, but back there I was being very, exploratory and open.
Yeah, I could play with the color, the fabric, the pockets on a shirt, but I'm always going to go back to something that I know fits well. I know that sits right and that people are going to enjoy.
Yeah,
that's the safe part that needs to be followed constantly.
All right, Massimo, we've taken up some of your time, but
I feel like I've taken up too much of your time.
Nah, not at all. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you coming and sharing. And I do want to say thank you too, because you're a younger person who's come on. You're the youngest guest that we've had, and I think one of the things that's important, and I said this to Jack yesterday when we were preparing for this, like I wanted to have a younger guest on as well, because I think often in our profession, we often look at experience as being the standard, but actually I think that there is a lot of novelty and a lot of openness and a lot of, enthusiasm that comes from youth. And whilst they may not have those experiences and they're not necessarily going to bring those things to the table, I think they bring, that enthusiasm that actually drives you to do open. So I'm really pleased that you were willing to come on. So thank you, mate.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk. Thanks, guys.